Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream where we cover the pressing issues of the day. You know, sometimes we talk about issues like education, whether that's K through 12 school choice or higher education, but sometimes we take a little bit of a break, take a step back and look at some of the major challenges facing us outside the direct arena of politics and policy. And today we're talking about woke corporations. If we've not met, I'm Kevin Roberts, your host. Today, I am privileged to be joined by a good friend and wonderful stalwart on this and many other issues in America. That's Rachel Bovard, Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute. Rachel, thanks so much for making time for this conversation.
Very glad to be here. Timely topic.
Well, it is, and we're going to delve into it with quite a bit of detail. In fact, as you and I were visiting a few moments ago, both of us were talking about how interested we are in hearing audience questions on this issue. So if you're in the audience and maybe you've been bashful over the last several months about asking a question, go ahead and pop one into the comment section of whatever social media channel you're using, because Rachel and I are both very interested in hearing your feedback on this. So we'll sort of set the table, Rachel, on this issue. But before we do that, just in case there are some viewers who are not familiar with the work of your great organization, the Conservative Partnership Institute, why don't you tell them what you do?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. So yes, I am the policy director here at Conservative Partnership Institute. We are almost 4 years old now. We are a group in Washington, D.C., led by former Senator Jim DeMint, and most recently joined by former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. And we are not a think tank, but we really try to focus on sort of the strategic and tactical elements of taking great conservative policy and getting it across the finish line. So to that end, I spend a lot of time training and teaching congressional staff, as well as members of Congress and senators, the latest sort of legislative strategy, also parliamentary procedure, so how the House and Senate floors work, sort of the novel and ingenious strategies used by my boss, former Senator DeMint, when he was there. But then we also do a lot of coalition building around key issues as well. So full-time job.
Well, it is. And I'm sure most of our audience members are familiar with you. But in case you're in the audience and you aren't, be sure to follow Rachel on Twitter, become familiar with the Conservative Partnership Institute. I will say, leading a state-based think tank that is active in Washington, D.C., that more than any other organization, the Conservative Partnership Institute is responsible for our even being able to have a chance at some success there. And I say that before we get into the issue, because a lot of you who watch this live stream routinely write me, some of you call me and you say, Kevin, we're just looking to be encouraged about the future. And I pass along this little inside baseball view of the conservative movement writ large nationally, because there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And this is not being Pollyannish about the future. And I'm hopeful that you in the audience here today in Rachel's commentary and some of our give and take, that even though we've got these huge challenges like dealing with woke corporations and their vocal involvement in the political and policy process, that we're beginning to push back on that in very successful, effective ways. We hope to give you some tips about how to do so. So, Rachel, in that spirit, let's jump right in. You know, we always start with the proverbial 30,000-foot view. It's what we do in the political and policy world. Let's identify the problem first before we get into some solutions. What's the scope and the scale, if you will, of this problem that we're facing with corporations?
Well, woke capital, I think, is really something that started developing, or we began noticing it a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And it's this concept of corporations not just concerned with making money, right? Corporations really concerned with addressing the culture and taking, serious political stances. And I think most troublingly, punishing people who disagree with them. And so you saw this sort of internally in some of these companies. You may remember Google firing James Damore for publishing, an essay or a policy paper really that broke down, how men and women code differently and things like that. And he was fired by Google for that. So initially, it was just internal to the corporations. But I think most recently, we've now seen it, escape the corporations and be inflicted upon the rest of us. So obviously we're very familiar right now with what's going on in Georgia. This is the second time we've seen Georgia punished by a lot of these corporations. Poor Georgia, first in 2019 when it passed the heartbeat bill, which said, that life begins at the moment you can hear the heartbeat in the womb. And for that, you saw movie studios pull out of Georgia. And now a similar thing is happening with their, election integrity law. Corporations have, refused to do business with Georgia for that. And I would point out, obviously, like, a key element of, I think, the woke corporations debate is the hypocrisy inherent within it, because so many of these companies who refuse to do business with Georgia or like states have no qualms and no compunction about doing business with China. China, who is committing a genocide against its Uyghur population, who routinely engages in, abuse of its workers, not to mention the fact that, it's an autocratic, totalitarian state where you don't even really have voting rights. But these companies will happily line up, to do business with Xi Jinping. But, Georgia, acting in its self-government capacity to pass a voter integrity law is a bridge too far. So increasingly, we're seeing, these corporations tell us that our way of life is unacceptable and they don't want to hire us. They don't want to do business with us. And I think most concerning lately is the fact that, this isn't just, a statement they're responding to or a group of people. What happened in Georgia twice now is, again, a self-government deciding, the people deciding and expressing their views through their self-government, how they want to order their state, and corporations trying to bully and punish them for doing that. So you're seeing sort of two constitutions at work here. I think the political constitution and the corporate constitution, and those are almost in conflict in a very aggressive way.
Well, they are, and there are a lot, of course, a lot of aspects to this issue that I want to unpack. But the first follow-up question is, are these threats by corporations to boycott states like Georgia? Of course, we're hearing this in Texas as well. Do they ever have an impact that meets in reality, that meets the scale of concern that elected officials and some people have about them?
I do think that it is a growing threat. A couple of years ago, we heard people say, oh, the stakes are really high. This is a threat to democracy, all these things. And, everyone was like, well, it's just really posturing in the marketplace. It doesn't really, it might not have that sort of lingering effect. But I think more and more it is becoming a very dangerous ideology that's sort of pervasive at the corporate level, because it's not just virtue signaling anymore. These companies are removing jobs, right? They're denying economic opportunity over political viewpoints. And that is inherently un-American, right? That's not something that we tolerate. And you're seeing it not just at the state level. I would also argue you're seeing it, for instance, with big tech, right? With what they did to Parler, when Apple, Google, and Amazon worked together to effectively kneecap a small business over political ideology. And so you're starting to see this sort of ideological enforcement, in the marketplace itself, which is antithetical to everything we know about the free market. And I think it's very confusing for a lot of us who were raised, right, to believe that in the market, businesses respond to the profit motive, and that's what drives them. But that, I think, is still true to some extent, but for these very large businesses, it's almost now become a question of not just, well, Republicans buy sneakers too, it's Republicans buy sneakers, but should they? And that, I think, is something that we have to take a step back and say, what is happening? Because that's a very different set of principles than we've seen before.
Yeah, well, let's go down that avenue. There are a couple of other paths I want to go down here before we turn to audience questions, and I'll leave the following gentleman's name out because he may not want me to mention it, but a very well-known, now retired CEO of a very well-known company was in our building here in Austin on Friday. And we started our conversation on this issue because he said, Kevin, in the decades that I was part of and then eventually led this national company, even though I have very deeply held conservative principles, not once, either publicly or in private meetings with a company, did I ever mention them, because our job was to produce our product at the fairest price that it could sell the largest number possible. And he said, now that I'm retired, I'm a lot more active. And so let's say he retired 10 years ago. The question, Rachel, is what's happened from then when I think most corporate CEOs of any ideological stripe were largely quiet, if not silent, on the matter of politics, to today, when you're as a corporation going to be vilified by your corporate peers if you don't participate in wokeism?
It's a great question. And I think, it's simply because of this. I think the loudest people in our society, which I don't think represent everyone, but it's a very small but very loud segment of our society, has made it not possible to remain neutral anymore.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, if you remember maybe it was a year or so ago at this point, Coinbase, which was a cryptocurrency company, their CEO said, we are not going to be politically active. We're going to maintain a neutral position here. That and 10 years ago, that would not be out of the ordinary, right? 10 years ago, I think people would be like, that's normal. What's abnormal is to take an overt political position as a company. But when he said that, he was vilified everywhere. He was vilified in the New York Times. He was vilified, all over sort of the woke corridors of power. And I think what that tells you is that those companies are responding to this very small but very loud element of our society. And you and I were talking about this piece I recently read by Richard Hanania, who is at Columbia University, when he sort of pondered this question of why is everything liberal? Why is everything, why are all these institutions liberal? And his explanation for it was actually quite simple. And it's that, between conservatives and liberals just care more about politics. And I think this, we try to break this down in policy, so many different ways, but I think it ends up being a dispositional question, which is that, as conservatives, part of our worldview is that there's so much more to life than politics, and that politics represents an element of our lives, but it's not our lives in totality. Well, sort of the progressive element of the left thinks differently. They think that they have made everything political. And not only that, they organize and they march and they put on pink hats and they, donate and they demand action by, every choice to them is political. And you're starting to see this now too in how, they target the internal workings of the corporations themselves. So SEIU recently put out a tweet, I think it was a week or two ago, targeting asset managers. So in the first round of voting on some of these boards, they were targeting asset managers and saying, you need to vote against all white boards. You need to, press for a diversity audit or like a racial equity audit. And so that's how much they care, is that they are really leaning into these sort of niche elements of corporate culture that have the power to change of everything the corporation does. And Hanania's thesis is simply, that conservatives don't do that, right? We historically don't march in the street. We may give money, but we also go to church and we have a lot of kids and we do other things. And that, he says, accounts for this gulf in sort of the institutional America and the rest of America. And it's resulted, unfortunately, I think, in conservatives being stripped of their power in a lot of these institutions.
No, it's true. One related follow-up, and then I want to pursue this question about what we should do about conservatives not caring as much. It's absolutely true. And it isn't bad, by the way, because what conservatives tend to care about are those enduring institutions of civil society, not to get overly academic, but these, what some academics call mediating institutions of human interaction. It actually, as I remind my liberal friends, especially from my graduate school days here in Austin, it makes us all more joyful. But the question is, on the matter of these asset managers and the state of corporate boards, we're fighting that here in Texas with some legislation on environmental social governance, which on the capital side, the capital seeking side, whether it's at the small level or well into the nine figures of capital that some oil and gas companies are seeking, it's becoming very difficult, if not impossible, in some circles to access that capital, which means that this agenda, the way you are describing it, is not at all exaggerated. If anything, we're sort of understating the effect that it's having well downstream of how businesses do business. So to sum up, there's a legislative side to that, and perhaps even a congressional side of that we can talk about. But I'm curious about the consumer side. I'm just going to assume that most people watching this or listening to it are trying to figure out what they can do. Just to go back to the thesis of the author you mentioned, how do we implement caring more about politics and policy in a way that might actually produce some results?
It's a great question. And I think the right is still struggling to deal with this because historically, again, we've relied on the profit motive, right? We've always, for 2 weeks or so after corporations do something we don't like, conservatives will like wring their hands and be like, well, I'm not going to drink Coke anymore. And then two weeks later, we're drinking Coke, or like, I'm not going to shop at Target, and then we're shopping at Target. And I think the bigger these corporations become and the more dominant they are, the harder it is to boycott them, right? The traditional way in which we've tried to make corporations feel pain is at our wallets, but you can't really boycott Google. If you live in the modern world, if you have a smartphone, you're on Google, whether you think you are or not. You can't necessarily stop flying an airline if it's the only one that gets you across the country. So for us, I think the right's going to have to get more creative. And I do think that unfortunately, we are going to have to lean in a little bit more to some of these political moments. It's no longer enough to say to opt out, right? Well, I mean, I guess I should say it is still an option, right? The sort of Rod Dreher Benedict option where you go and sort of build your own walled garden and live there with your community and you never step foot outside. I think that is an option, for the right. But the other option is if you're not going to do that, then I think you are almost compelled at this point to sort of step into the breach and say, no, it is my job to be on that board. And it is my job to withstand, all the insanity that's going to come down on my head for saying no.
Yeah.
And I think the right's just going to have to get more to toughen up to that reality, I think, because again, we are losing our power. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that, then society reflects the preferences of your competitors at that point.
Yeah, that's right. I love your referring to Rod Dreher and the Benedict option. Rod and I have gone round and round about that for years. And I happen to think, just before I get back to the main thread here, that while that might be what some people are called to do, the difficulty is that's a losing proposition, right? I mean, we know from all of military history that there are many principles of warfare that apply to politics, which may not surprise people who think that politics is really rough and tumble. And one of them is you better be on offense if you're expecting to win. You are not going to win if you're constantly on defense, which I think is what the Benedict option does. But it does beg the question, which you answered well, I think, which is what do we do? And in order for us to win, we have to be more involved. Our viewers and others need to join boards. They need to be more outspoken. But the point is that requires something that's in very short supply today, and that's courage. We see that, just to pivot to a question I wanted to ask you about regarding elected officials. We see just an utter lack of political courage in many, if not most, of our elected officials. And yet, am I right in assessing here in the first half of 2021 that perhaps, even though that continues to be a problem, we are seeing more elected officials being willing to stand up because they're seeing folks like you and me and our organizations and many others say, we're going to give you the political cover to take a stand on it?
I think that's what has to happen. I think that we have to join forces in this regard. And something I was actually really encouraged about was, when Georgia started pushing back on some of these companies, Texas said, yeah, we support them and you better not try that, BS here because there'll be consequences. Like that, I thought was very interesting and encouraging. So that sort of red state alliance to say you're not going to be bullied alone. But I think it's incredibly difficult. And I don't want to undersell, I think, what we're asking people to do to fight back against this, because I think oftentimes we talk about, well, just be courageous, just stand up, and like it's easy at all the time, and it's not. And one of the reasons it's not is because the left has cloaked everything in the elements of racism and bigotry and just these awful names and stains, to the extent where being called a racist in America is almost worse than being called a murderer. Right? There's nothing worse than being called a racist. And yet, unfortunately, the left uses that for every single thing. And I think it works. I am optimistic in some regard, again, the Texas, Georgia example, but I'm also disappointed in the sense that last week, the Senate spent its entire week on this Asian American discrimination bill, this hate crime bill, based on very little evidence, unnecessary new law. We already have hate crimes legislation in place. no Republican voted against it. The only Republican that voted against it was Senator Josh Hawley, and he did so because he felt it created a dangerous monitoring of speech, right? Which it did. But again, this idea that all of our elected politicians, I think, are very terrified of being called racist because it's, again, the worst thing in the world. And I see this on campuses too. I mean, you probably do as well, that a lot of times we ask, young conservative groups to stand up against the left on their campus, but the consequences have become so dire that it's like your grades and your friends and your social groups are now all at risk, that it is a difficult thing. In my lifetime anyway, I've never seen it so difficult to have a contrary viewpoint. That used to be celebrated in this country. It is now penalized, and not just, socially, but sometimes financially. And I think that's, again, the really dangerous thing we're seeing here, going back to sort of the first question about woke capital, is that if you don't have the right ideology, you're cut off from the guts of capitalism in some senses. And I think, so it's not just going to be courage, but I think we also have to have a legislative response in some capacity to sort of ensure that, again, the mechanisms and the main streets of capitalism are not shut off to people simply because they hold a counter-narrative political belief.
Yeah. And I think a good place to start on that, and an effort we're behind here, since we're in the middle of the Texas legislative session, is to cut off state subsidies to corporations that are playing that game. And we need a lot more states doing that. And perhaps one creative, more regional, if not national, solution would be turning to one of our favorite strategies in our movement, which is an interstate compact. And as you said, a red state alliance. And that's something that perhaps if a viewer is looking into something to get behind, something tangible, that's the kind of thing that can work. And it has a communications aspect to it that I think is really helpful if you are an elected official, right-minded, but saying, look, I can go to war, but if I don't have an army behind me, then it really is sort of political suicide. I understand that. Let me ask you one question, one additional question, Rachel, before we turn to audience questions, and that is about big tech. You've been outspoken, in fact, perhaps the most outspoken person on our side in the United States about what we need to do to rein in the power of big tech. In a nutshell, what's the problem and what do you propose as a solution?
So I think the problem here is vast and unprecedented. I think we have 3 or 4 major corporations in America who have accumulated unprecedented amounts of power, not just over speech. We all talk about big tech as a threat to free speech, but it's also a threat to the flow of free information, which has downstream effects on independent thought and how people form their views, and that has downstream effects on how people vote, how people engage in society, what they think about their neighbor, and then increasingly also it's an access or threat to the access of the free market. This is what we saw again with Parler, and in the wake of President Trump getting deplatformed, we saw a lot of these corporations, cut off access to, his credit card processing, his email, his banks wouldn't do business with him. Now that's separate from the big tech issue, but I think it's all related because, these companies very much have begun to change our society, to change, what it means to be a free person in America. And, I'm a conservative, so I didn't always see the threat coming from the free market, right? 99% of the time, the free market works just great. But when you have companies at this scale, when Google filters information for 90% of the world, what it suppresses and what it amplifies changes, what people think and how they think and what information they have access to. That is a whole different ballgame. And increasingly now we're seeing these big tech companies, in lockstep with one political ideology. And when you have big government working with big tech to silence political opponents or change, speech, or as we're seeing with a host of political figures, suppress criticism, suppress public criticism, which is the basis of our democracy, that kind of dissent and engagement, when they stop that changes everything. And so I consider, big tech at this scale to be a major threat to liberty. And this, I think, is one of the most pressing issues that our government needs to deal with, because it is changing, I think, the nature of what it means to be an American. And that troubles me greatly.
Well, likewise, and I don't think that's an overstatement. Well, look, I would enjoy continuing to ask you questions, but the smartest questions come from our audience, and we have several in the queue. We'll get to at least a few of them. And the first one, Rachel, is about the media. This audience member asks, how do we fight the news speak?
Yeah, that's a great short, pithy way of putting it, because that's really what it is, right? It is sort of this totalitarian control over speech. It reminds me of one example I just want to throw out there to explain how significant this problem is, because people think it's just in the media where language is changing and what we talk about and how we talk about and what they even cover is also changing. But if you all remember during the confirmation hearing for Amy Coney Barrett, she kept using the word preference when she was asked about sexual preference. And Senator Mazie Hirono, a Democrat from Hawaii, was like, no, that is offensive. The word preference is offensive because it assumes one can choose a gender. And everyone was like, what? Like, preference has never meant that. Within 5 minutes, Merriam-Webster, the online dictionary, had updated the terminology. So literally speech changing in real time, the definition of words changing in real time to fit a narrative. It's the best example I can think of, sort of a micro example of a macro problem. And, this is, I think, one of the most important things that we have to do is sort of step away from sort of the corporate media outlet and really begin to focus on our own outlets, right? You have the Federalist, you have Newsmax to an extent, other smaller networks, I think, that are building up a presence. That is the only way around this, as far as I can tell, because I do rely on the corporate media be clowning itself. I hope, right? I hope that they are so obviously ridiculous that people try to see this. But again, we have to stop giving them our eyeballs and we have to stop giving them our money.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think about some of the media presence that all of you at the Conservative Partnership Institute have. Many organizations doing something along these lines. We started this live stream during COVID because we couldn't have a live audience in the People's Republic of Austin. And now this continues to be something that people want to tune into. Many other great examples, but the point is there is a desire by regular people to consume news that's factual. For that matter, there's a desire, to think about a related aside, of regular people to consume sports just for the sake of sports. I had someone tell me, Kevin, we need to start a conservative sports network. I said, no, we don't. We just need a sports network. We're wanting to consume sports without thinking about politics. It's one of the great escapes. Well, that's perhaps a good transition into the second question from our audience, Rachel, which is, what are some real ways that everyday Americans can help to move the needle on this, to help make a solution or produce a solution on woke corporatism?
So I think that's the great question, right? Because I think we're all sort of struggling to figure out how can we impact this? Because again, the right doesn't really have a language almost to talk about when the threat comes from the market, right? The market's supposed to solve problems. It's not supposed to create problems. But I think, again, it goes back to sort of Richard Hanania's thesis, which is the right does need to get a little bit more active here. It's no longer enough to say, well, I can't really do anything, so whatever, I'll vote and politics, I'm going to let those cats and dogs fight it out in Washington and that's it. No, that can't be it anymore. I think engagement, and I'm not just talking about the federal level, your local level, right? So much of this wokeness is happening in the schools, right? We need people who are willing to sort of stand up against it in the school board meetings, either on the school board or as a concerned parent. When you're sending your kids to college, to be able to arm them, with ability to fight back against so many of these pressures. And even if you're a small business, to recognize also that, the colleges and universities have been the progenitor of this wokeness, right? We all laughed at it 10 years ago. We were like, what is a gender studies major from Dartmouth going to do with her life? Ha, 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 ha. And then now she's like a content manager at Google and she's silencing you, right?
Yeah.
We didn't see that coming. So maybe if you're a smaller employer, be like, that kind of college education is not worthwhile to me. Mm-hmm. It might be something where you hire someone straight out of high school, or there's a vocational training program, or, hire from colleges and universities that, don't traffic in this kind of literally racism. I don't know what else to call it. It is actual racism. But I think small changes like that over time do add up. Mm-hmm. And I also think the last thing I will say is this, I sort of came of age in the end of the Bush administration and the Tea Party wave. I worked, I was Senator Rand Paul. I was his legislative director, worked for a number of free market senators. the right has always had this reflexive alliance with business that we've not allowed to, we've just been unquestioning in this regard. We say, oh, the corporations have done something I don't like, but yet Republican lawmakers are the first to bend over backwards, when those businesses line up at the trough. Tax cuts are the first things we pass for corporations. It may be time, I think, for us to get more critical. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying criticize capitalism, which is still the best system in the world. Mm-hmm. But I think when these corporations are going to play stupid political games, they need to win stupid political prizes. Mm-hmm. And so to the point that you made about stripping, the subsidies, I get into these debates a lot with libertarians on the right who are like, well, these corporations are just expressing their free speech. Nobody has, so we cannot punish them. Nobody has a constitutional right to a lobbyist authored special tax subsidy. I'm sorry. That is not in the Constitution. So I do think it is appropriate for, especially at the state level, action to be taken to say, you cannot push around in a freely elected legislature without consequence. So I think the right has to get better at that.
Yeah, that's something that all of us can participate in. And in fact, your excellent response there began to answer an additional question from another audience member, which is, what are some everyday small steps we can take to make a tangible difference? In other words, responding to this article you mentioned about conservatives not caring about politics. And I will just add on a few, because it's something that this question I field quite a bit, especially being a lifelong educator. I would encourage those of you with children and grandchildren or nieces and nephews or friends, which will be almost all of you, to think more critically about the schools that your children attend. Starting with your K through 12 schools, and don't assume necessarily that just because it's a private school that it's immune from what Rachel is talking about. Be particularly critical about colleges, and be especially so regarding your alma mater, whichever that is. We have a very natural affinity to especially the college that formed us, but we have to be very critical of most universities in this country. I say all of that, Rachel, to write a little bit larger headline, which is, I think the time has come to disengage from the institutions, whether they be media or education or otherwise, that are too far gone. But it's going to take too much energy and money to fix them, and start building our own. And you've referenced that regarding media. You and some of our viewers know that I've done so in the educational space. And I think the more we do that, even though they are small steps, that they are going to accrue to a very large solution. And we will wake up one day to point to some optimism and realize that we've won. It's just that we have to start now. We can't throw our hands up in the air and say, for example, the last election was stolen, America's gone. I don't believe that. I know that you don't, but we do have to get busy about the work ahead. Let me ask you one more question, and then we'll move toward wrapping up here, Rachel. This audience member asks, is it just a few people with the loudest voices who are controlling the narrative and energy of this issue? Or are we genuinely seeing the fabric of our society change?
This is something I do worry about a lot. And one of the reasons I've been so engaged on the big tech fight is because I see big tech sort of contributing at scale to this problem. Because when you push, one point of view on people and you tell them it's objective, and you lie to them that it's objective, and you hide all of the dissenting opinions and arguments, and you suppress anyone saying otherwise, you do start to change what it means to be a free person in a free society. And that is what is happening. And so I do very much worry about the fraying of society along those bounds. And, even to the point that you raised about building our own institutions, I think that is vital. And I think it's necessary to our survival, but it also makes me sad a little bit in the sense that we are really building two countries to some extent, because think about it. When I have engaged a lot with Parler in the last 3.5 months since they basically got wiped off planet Earth. And what that taught us is that if we are going to build our own anything, we have to actually build our own infrastructure, right? We can't even sit on top of the infrastructure, because that's been captured by this sort of woke element. And what I mean by that is, Parler got kicked off its web hosting service, which was Amazon. Who thought about that? Who thought that, again, the pipeline of the internet would turn on you? And so, our society is changing in that regard. But I do think that, I hope anyway, and I think the more, we call attention to this problem and think deeply about it and engage it at the local and national levels, the pendulum will always swing, and I think our history teaches this. I've been reading a lot about sort of the riots of, the 60s and how, we responded to them, and sort of the sort of change in our politics that resulted in, and taking a little bit of hope from that. But I think what's incumbent upon all of us is to make sure that when the pendulum swings, there's something for it to swing back to.
Mhm.
And so, building our institutions, to your point, and I think really taking back the education that we've ceded that, right? I think we've ceded public education, we've ceded grounds at universities, we've ceded some of the cultural institutions. So I think really aggressing back in that way. And I think, again, working through our self-government, I don't want to bypass that, because I think it's a really important element. We don't elect people to tie one hand behind their back and just say, ooh, oh, well, right? We elect people to say, limited government has one role, and it's to protect the foundations of this country. And when they are under assault, it is time to think creatively and time to stand up against, this sort of woke progressive left and fight, if not as hard, then harder. I often, and I'm giving a little bit of a long-winded answer, and I apologize, but
Oh, it's awesome. Keep going.
okay. Well, I often am told, well, we do have to fight with one hand behind our back, because that's what the founders wanted. They wanted limited government. And I want limited government as well. But don't you think for a second, those founders weren't lit by revolution and the rebellion that is our birthright. George Washington, didn't tie one hand behind his back when he, crossed the river and attacked the Hessians on Christmas.
Yep.
That is not, the nature of a person who is shy and retiring. So I think we need to get that spirit back within the conservative movement, and use all of the elements of power at the state and local levels to just say no. We stand to thwart history, and we yell, not on my watch. And I think we need to see a little bit more of that.
What a terrific exhortation. Thanks so much. That's a great segue into the final question that I asked our guest, Rachel, and I can't wait for your answer to this. And that is, in spite of all of the challenges we're facing, I mean, here you and I have spent half an hour talking about a very challenging issue. In spite of that, in spite of COVID, in spite of the equally bad shutdowns, in spite of an election that probably for most of our viewers didn't go the way they were hoping, in spite of having a funeral director as president of the United States. What I mean by that is he's already writing the obituary for this country, which I find morally reprehensible. In spite of all of that, why did you wake up this morning optimistic about America?
Because it's the best country in the world. I'm always reminded frequently these days of a Patrick Moynihan quote, former senator, obviously, when he stood on the floor of the United Nations and he said, "Am I ashamed to defend a less than perfect democracy? I am not. Show me its equal." And that motivates me every single day. I love this country, and I'm not going to let it go down, not on my watch.
Amen. Well, Rachel, it's always a treat to visit with you. I know that our viewers appreciate your wisdom, your optimism, but also your courage. And I want to thank you for that as a fellow American. For those of you who are watching, thanks so much for taking time out of your day, for making it possible for us to do the work that we do here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation and also at the Conservative Partnership Institute. May the Lord continue to prosper the work of our hands. We have plenty of work ahead, but as you just heard from Rachel, there are many reasons to charge those hills.